I Oh, hi. Dialogue conspiracy, a little confusion in the control room here. How's everybody today with all the news coming in so fast? How's the Senate hearings going? We saw 2 days, Thursday and Friday, for those of you who watched the Senate hearings. A lot of information is coming over in a 5-hour period each day. I'm not going to give you a summary of my impressions of those things that occurred this week. There were a lot of ideas I had, but I have to take the events that broke in the newspaper today that are of primary importance, and then we'll go back to the other if we have time. There's one similarity to the Warren Commission that the Senate reminded me. Sam Ervin was on a television show yesterday and gave his little speech that he was sure that Nixon wouldn't have to be quizzed. He doubts that Nixon will have to come before the Senate hearings on the Watergate affair, and he said it's highly improbable that his investigation will question or seek any written statement from President Nixon about any involvement in the Watergate scandal. That brought to mind the day that the Warren Commission met, and Earl Warren went on the steps of the hearings and said that it was no conspiracy. Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone, and everything was safe in the country, to that effect. I never could see why they had to call 552 witnesses if their conclusions were made before they ever got started. When the Watergate affair broke and I recognized the espionage operation that was identical to the past political assassinations that alter our elections, I began a cross-filing system, and one of the envelopes I have, which is about 260 different envelopes on the subject now, is similarities to the Warren Commission hearings. And one of them today that I'll take note is the Sam Ervin telling you that he doesn't have to call President Nixon. That's telling you that he won't be asked or charged with anything. They're not going to look for him to take the responsibility. It may be that he'll be fooled and the witnesses will just come out and produce memos, but I don't think the president puts anything down on a written memo. Everything is oral. That's part of espionage operations, oral agreements. Deniability and oral agreements. So if somebody wants written proof that Richard Nixon signed a check for a provocateur and that it's in his bank account down at San Clemente, you're not going to find it. The very part of the espionage operation is that it's oral. That is, as important as the alias or the disguises or the money washing, is the fact that everything is oral and can't be found. But Sam Ervin has said he doubts that he'll quiz Richard Nixon. Robert Odle was the witness at the first day, and he went about telling you how everything was very nicely destroyed at the office, and the destruction began immediately after the arrest of James McCord, who was hired by the committee to re-elect the president. And he tells you how the files were burned and evidence was shredded. And the public officials from the Justice Department that went into there, like Mr. Mardian, Robert Mardian, and Fred LaRue, he was very careful not to mention their names at all, that these two gentlemen were out in California with Patrick Gray and John Mitchell, came back to Washington, and went right to the office and went about destroying the records. LaRue has been mentioned up to this point as being in on paying the men for silence and also of destruction of records when they were arrested. But until James McCord talked Friday, the following day of the hearings, the second day, Martin was brought up in another connection, but not in terms of destroying evidence. Now, Martin was the Assistant Attorney General. Patrick Gray was the head of the FBI. Both of these men were destroying evidence. It's very hard to come to a conclusion that Richard Nixon is guilty or who did the operation, because there's several methods of concealing all the evidence, again, identical to the Warren Commission hearing or any criminal conspiracy. You destroy as much evidence as you can, and you leave no written records, and then you fall back on national security. Well, Patrick Gray has destroyed important documents that never should see the light of day. Robert Mardian went into the office and destroyed the records. Now, some of the problem with these records, they didn't ask Robert Odle at all about what these papers were or whether they had to do with Robert Mardian's work in the Justice Department with lists of radicals that would be rounded up. Nothing important was asked to Robert Odle on that nature, and he was totally innocent of anything that was happening. He didn't do anything. He told them how to use the shredding machine, and then they did the shredding. Everybody is leaning on somebody else. The men could say, well, we couldn't do the shredding machine without Robert Odle. It goes around and around in circles. He simply was there to show them how to use the machine, and they threw all the stuff in and destroyed it. The Senate hearing in terms of Robert Odle had one important revelation. He described Mr. Shepard, who took boxes of Howard Hunt's out of the White House. Well, for those of you who heard the shows for weeks, since June on the Watergate affair and the allegations that Louis Tackwood made about the spy, the separate espionage operation that worked inside the White House with all departments of government, FBI, CIA, and Justice Department, I knew that the material that was taken out of Mr. Hunt's desk in the White House immediately after the arrest had to do with Operation Intercept, otherwise called Squad 19, described yesterday and today in the press as the Secret Intelligence Unit. Well, who took the secret police unit? Mr. Odle said that Mr. Shepard took it. And where did Mr. Shepard come from? From the Department of Transportation. Well, A. Jill Crow surfaced at the time of the Ellsberg trial for saying, I take full responsibility for having Howard Hunt and Mr. Liddy fly to Beverly Hills and rob the doctor's files of Mr. Ellsberg and bringing some Cubans from Miami to Beverly Hills to help with the robbery and photograph these papers. Jill Crow from the Department of Transportation took all responsibility for this operation, and he is the liaison to the Central Intelligence Agency with the Deputy Assistant Director there, Mr. Cushman, who went on to be the head of the entire Marine Corps. And Mr. Cushman said that he had the approval of Richard Helms. So the path that I'm trying to lead, if you have a pencil and take down notes from this show to look back later, A. Jill Crow went to the Department of Transportation, and Mr. Shepard is at the Department of Transportation. So it's very easy that these cartons could go the same chain of command as the Ellsberg thing and end up back at the CIA, that Howard Hunt, as an agent of the CIA for so many years, could take all of his papers to the Department of Transportation, then back to the CIA. Then, when you get an investigator like Mr. Cox, who appears on the scene and says, I promise to be very objective, I'll leave no stone unturned, there isn't anything under the stone. The stone has been moved around so many times that no investigator, you can get the best investigator in the country, the most objective, the most honest, the most bipartisan investigator. But if the Attorney General is helping stall the investigation, if the head of the FBI is destroying evidence, if some of the evidence is returned back to the Central Intelligence Agency and into the hands of not the investigative agencies, but the people who planned the operation, the best investigator in the world isn't going to find anything. And then he can say, we've looked everywhere, and these are the culprits at this level, and drop it all. I don't see any plan right now to get A. Jill Crow on the stand or Mr. Shepard and really ask about what is in the cartons, and they'd say, I didn't read them, I just moved the cartons. Well, who gave you the orders? And they go through this circle, go round and around, and you'll never know what was in those cartons or where they are today. You know the path of operating, and you watch the operatives move, but it's hard to pin anything on them. John Mitchell this morning made a very interesting confession at an interview. He said, I never did anything mentally or morally wrong. These operatives who have this entire police state, who lock up innocent prisoners, life sentences, death penalties, assassinate people that are running against Richard Nixon, don't consider it mentally or morally wrong. They don't consider it wrong to drop bombs over villages in Cambodia tonight. If it's not mentally or morally wrong to kill in another country or to rob or conduct espionage against other nationalities, why is it wrong to do it at home? He considers himself very clean. John Mitchell said, I've never stole any money. The only thing I did was try to get the president reelected. Now, he goes before these huge, the Justice Department represents these huge corporations that are squeezing out every private small businessman. And the small businessman, the small gasoline station attendant doesn't have gasoline to sell. The small drugstore isn't able to operate against the big chains, the department stores, whatever it is, the small markets. If the large corporations give enough money to Richard Nixon's election, they get the decision. If there's something to break up these conglomerates at the Justice Department, he favors it in their favor. He doesn't steal any money, but he just starves off the whole capitalistic system by settling cases out of court in exchange for money to elect the president. So he says, I never stole any money. The only thing I did was to try to get the president reelected. But in the process of the way he does it, he is stealing money from private business men, private enterprise, to keep all of the money and business and contracts in the hands of a few people. Just like Charles Colson leaves the White House and goes to the Teamsters, and so the United Farm Workers doesn't get their contracts with the growers. He doesn't call it stealing, but the chain of command is such that the small businessman and the farm worker and everyone on down gets hurt by his tactics. He made one interesting sentence. John Mitchell said, he was critical of the senators for not cross-examining James McCord. He said, I was critical of them for failing to examine Mr. McCord more. Well, coming from John Mitchell, who worked with James McCord in his own apartment and hired him, I thought that was very interesting that he wanted information from McCord that he didn't give. Well, I had the same feeling Friday. I was thoroughly disgusted when Mr. Baker, from the Senator Baker, asked, what should we ask you, Mr. McCord? Give us some questions when we meet again on Tuesday, because maybe you know something we should ask you. And I was thoroughly disgusted because I realized this could very easily be a whitewash of the entire thing, like it was the Warren Commission, where Jack Ruby writes his own polygraph tests and everyone writes their own questions before the commission. So I sent out a letter after that program Friday. I sent a letter to every member of the Senate Judiciary that's on that committee, the 7 men. And then I called Mr. Thompson, the investigator, and gave him some information and was really shocked. Either he's playing stupid or he is passing off something that he doesn't want to know or he really didn't know. And I picked up the phone and called him at his home in Washington and said, have you ever heard of Lewis Tackwood? And he said, no. I said, have you ever heard the martial law plan for San Diego, Miami? And he said, no. I said, okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll send you copies of the Realist he wanted. I told him about my article, and I said, I'll send you a lot of information and letters, and I sent off a package to all of the members on the committee and to the 2 chief investigators, Mr. Dash and Mr. Thompson. And I said, here's some questions you can ask James McCord when he takes the stand next week. So let's see if they have the nerve to ask any of these questions. But if they don't, they assured me they could call him back. So we'll just keep barraging him with some more questions. I brought up the point of Mr. Martin and Mr. White that he said he didn't know about, but people who listen to this show know about. Because in 1971, Lewis Tackwood said there was a secret espionage operation at the Republican National Conventions that would create martial law and round up the radicals. And the code names in the White House were Mr. Martin and Mr. White. And when James McCord registered at the Washington police station, he signed in as Edward Martin of New York. Now, it's interesting at the stand that James McCord said he signed in as Mr. Warren, but I gave them the references of Mr. Martin, the investigators for the Senate committee. Then I went on in my letter and said the name for Howard Hunt in the Glass House tapes that Lewis Tackwood has, the book, was Mr. White. His code name at the White House to call as agent provocateur was Mr. White. So I suggested the committee look up 4 sources. One was the New York Times, October the 25th, 1971, where Lewis Tackwood talked about martial law plans and Squad 19 and the secret espionage government behind the Republican government that is a police state, a Gestapo. The second reference I gave was Glass House tapes by Lewis Tackwood, and they could subpoena. Now they're ready at Avon Press. Page 237, where he says, I'm giving you 2 names. There's Martin and there's White. Martin was my code name and conduit. He's CIA. The third reference I gave was Washington Post, June 18th, 1932, an article by Alfred Lewis on 5 men were identified by the Washington police, and it says that Edward Martin of New York and Washington was a retired CIA, and then Martin turned out to be James McCord. And the fourth reference was the Los Angeles Times, June the 20th, 1972, that said when the men were arrested, 2 men had in their pockets the name of Howard Hunt with a notation W. White and W. H. Meaning White House. I guess those were his initials. So I gave the committee that information. I said, now, if you want some questions for James McCord Tuesday, ask him about McCord Associates, because James McCord said that one of his purposes was that they were concerned about radicals and demonstrations at the Republican convention. And ask him why, if they wanted to get radicals, it was necessary to set up a dummy front intelligence operation under the name of McCord Associates that had no clients of any kind except John Mitchell. Because if radicals were going to be at the convention that would cause trouble with our two-party electoral system, the police in Miami and the Secret Service could handle those radicals adequately with all the weapons they needed. But why did they need to open McCord Associates with all the secret funding? And I said, while he's on the stand, ask him about his daily meetings with Robert Mardian and where the lists of radicals were that they were going to round up in the event that they had trouble down in Miami at the time of the convention. Mr. McCord talked about Mardian, but not in terms of rounding up radicals. And I said, ask him why don't you ask James McCord about his emergency contingency unit, because in all of this, that's been very played down, that he was in charge of mail and communications at the time if martial law took place, and that he worked with the White House. You see, they make James McCord as something apart from the White House. And I also asked them about Mr. Wong of the Secret Service that originally hired McCord and why they're so quiet about the role of Mr. Wong. And I asked them about Andrew Topping in New York, and we'll go to that in more depth in a minute. Andrew Topping was the man who was supposed to kill Richard Nixon at the time between the time of the nomination and the election. Why didn't they ask him anything if he knew Mr. Topping? If he was in charge of security for the committee and Richard Nixon, did he know Andrew Topping personally or hear about him? And in other words, I want to find out how much security he was really doing, or was he really an attack group, an operational group that was going to attack radicals, and that the handling of Mr. Topping came through the Secret Service, but that McCord and Hunt and Liddy were a total attack group and not saving us from radicals. I want them to ask him when he was on the stand, how come he had his own radio frequency? Do the Democratic security chiefs have their own radio frequency and walkie-talkies that connected like into the White House? Why did he have his own radio frequency? Well, I gave a list of a lot of questions. I don't know if the committee's going to use them or whitewash the whole thing. It's hard to tell. But just having McCord on brought out a whole chain of command that they didn't expect that they would ever open up. And one of the interesting things it brought out were some names here. The name, I can't pronounce it. It's a hard name to pronounce. It's a chief police detective. It sounds like a Polish name, and I'll spell it to you. It's Illasewicz. And they traced this man. He's from New York Police Department, and they asked James McCord on the stand about the threat on his life in the event that he didn't go along and say that nobody was responsible at the White House. If he kept quiet for a year and was paid off with silence, he would be all right. But if he didn't, he received a threat on the telephone. And the name of the man who made the threat came out in the news. He's a member of the police department in New York City. Ulasewicz, I'll call him, I don't know if I pronounce it right. But the chain of command of the threat is very interesting, because if Richard Nixon wants to get rid of somebody who's exposing his government that would fall like the teapot down, he doesn't take a gun out of the White House and say, let's kill McCord. Richard Nixon sits at the top of power, and he doesn't want his little building to topple down. And then he has Robert Haldeman at one door, which is the link to the Central Intelligence Agency, and Howard Hunt and Charles Colson and all the intelligence agencies in the country, which were in Howard Hunt's desk in the White House. And the other man is John Ehrlichman, who's in charge. This is the martial law plan, the domestic intelligence unit and internal security, and he worked with Robert Mardian. Mr. Sullivan of the FBI is the link to Robert Mardian, former FBI who fought with J. Edgar Hoover and lined up with Mardian. Now, Robert Mardian was meeting every day with James McCord. This is the chain of command I've drawn down, meeting daily. But when James McCord was told to be silent and not talk, he had 3 meetings with John Caulfield. And that was a name new to most people when the hearings came up Friday, John Caulfield. Well, John Colville's background is such that he was in the New York Police Department for 10 to 16 years. It isn't quite sure. I read several accounts. He worked for the police department, and in 1968 he went to work for Richard Nixon. And he was a special guard visiting people in New York. Now, this is the way political assassinations take place. Special guards are the ones on the scene. They belong to espionage operations. And his original job was to assist in guarding Richard Nixon. Now, to guard him means to guard everything about him. Therefore, Mr. Colville can call James McCord because he evidently guards Richard Nixon's reputation as much as he guards Richard Nixon's body. The Secret Service, which is set up in a certain manner, isn't responsible for a lot of these things that come down because of the lower echelon. They have other agents that can conduct criminal acts if necessary. So guarding Mr. Nixon means more than just what the Secret Service does. And it was Mr. Caulfield who had 3 meetings with James McCord and tried to tell him to be quiet and not to follow the game plan as he used it. Well, there was an interesting point. When he got a telephone, Caulfield met 3 times with McCord, but he didn't make the phone call that threatened McCord's life. This other gentleman made a phone call, and McCord said he felt threatened for his wife and children. He said, "I'm not afraid to die. My will is made out." But this other gentleman with a New York accent called him. And Mr. Ulasewicz, I guess, I can't say the name, Ulasewicz. Now, he works 26 years with the New York Police Department. He worked 26 years and has a New York accent, and he picks up the phone and is the one who made the threat, evidently. Now, at the time he made this threat was after these January meetings, 3 of them, where McCord was not going to be bought off for silence, for taking the rap and hiding everybody else. But in August, Mrs. Topping was murdered. Her husband was an extreme right-wing radical with a arsenal of weapons who had intended to kill Richard Nixon between the time of the nomination and the election. Mrs. Topping had been murdered, and Andrew Topping was stopped from going into the White House, but I think his money, which has to be, I'm sure the Secret Service must have a list of it somewhere, he had passed some money off to the Secret Service. It would be interesting to see if they were consecutive $100 bills and linked to the other chain of command. Andrew Topping was from the University of Pennsylvania, spent 2 years in the Army. He did graduate work at Columbia University. He's described as brilliant and articulate. His wife died just before he surfaced as the man who planned to kill Richard Nixon, and he said that she died from right-wing radical group, which is his own group. And this, from New York City, comes Andrew Topping, comes John Caulfield, and comes this other gentleman who had made the telephone threat to James McCord. Well, in August, Mrs. Topping died. In December, Mrs. Hunt was killed. And this was just 2 weeks or so prior to the meeting starting with Caulfield. So when McCord gets a threat, a man from a New York accent, and he meets Caulfield 3 times, and he gets a phone call from this other man with a New York accent, that threat is the one that he fears that his wife and his children's lives are in danger. So the chain of command doesn't come from Richard Nixon and McCord just saying, look, if you don't if you don't stop embarrassing me, I'm going to kill you. There's a chain of command, like from Nixon to Ehrlichman to Mardian to Caulfield to right on down to the New York call, the one that really threatens him. And you have to tell yourself, is this the way when you want to wipe somebody out or silence them, you use another voice? See, with that New York accent, you use another voice to keep your agent quiet. All of these things are terribly important because don't forget Arthur Bremer was in New York City. And he stayed at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and we never knew who he was with or what people. And the man that he was with had a distinct New York accent, and James McCord said this man had a distinct New York accent. He was with somebody up at the ferry boat in Michigan who had a New York accent. And it would be nice because of the description of the man in Maryland that changed the license numbers where, I said James Ray, I mean Arthur Bremer. I'm talking about the Wallace. It would be nice to take the gentleman from Maryland and identify him to somebody that was seen in Michigan with Arthur Bremer, and then take the voice of the man who threatened James McCord and see if there are any similarities between these 2 New Yorkers, Mr. Caulfield and this other gentleman. and the one that threatened James McCord, to see if they were using the same operatives to frighten James McCord, the ones that shot Wallace. It's a big city with 9 million people, but a lot of the links are hunches that I've had, and I stay with them long enough. I do have a way of fitting those pieces together and seeing the patterns of the New York voice doing the threats, instead of his 3 meetings with Caulfield being sufficient. Well, for those of you who have read my article in The Realist, and we refer to it almost every week, they're on sale at the Thunderbird. I brought some more back from San Francisco, and there's some here at KLRB. If you want them, the whole idea of the article I wrote in July was that last July was that there was a secret intelligence unit that worked inside the White House, that worked with the CIA and the FBI and the Justice Department and all departments of government, that sole purpose was to see that selected agents remain in office in the White House, eliminate candidates that oppose that man in the White House, and I tried to show the way this espionage operation worked. Yesterday and today, the New York Times broke a story, the story now that will be in the news all week, called A White House Spy Unit. And this is the story, this is the way it broke it. There is a secret intelligence unit since 1970. And the purpose, this is the cover story now, the purpose is to collect and evaluate information about radicals and anti-war group. I'll show you why that's a cover story, because when Louis Tackwood, the agent provocateur, surfaced and talked about Squad 19, and he has it in Glasshouse tapes on page 240, he said that each of the upper echelon operatives involved, and you must remember, this isn't from Glasshouse tapes, it is important to remember that all of these men were hired by the White House under the guise to protect secrets like the Pentagon Papers from reaching the public. Their cover story was media control. They would bug newspaper men and the media, and they would also protect stories like the Pentagon Papers from reaching the public. Now, it seems they were bugging Daniel Ellsberg a long time before the Pentagon Papers were printed. So they allowed them to be printed to come down on laws and create the excuse for Hunt and Liddy and the operatives being in the White House in case they should ever be discovered. That may sound complicated. Let me put it another way. The prison in California, the prison system, which is connected to the same operatives, made up their mind that George Jackson would never leave the California prison system, and every kind of offer was made to get him and to kill him, and offer parole to kill him before he ever had a trial, because he was going to court 2 days after he was killed, just 2 days after that death, that shootout. He was supposed to go to court, and those men were acquitted. They were not guilty of the charges, the Soledad brothers. But George Jackson was dead. But by arranging his being murdered and not having a trial for Jackson, they could round up pet radicals, political radicals, and either kill them or have get them in jail for life with long prison sentences. And then they brought in chains and all kinds of restrictions in prison about mail and visitors, and glass partitions and courts glassed often, searches every time you go in and search, and taking your clothing and parts of them off and feeling you. Every time you get a planned conspiracy, you get many repressions that come with it, many excuses for repressions. The George Jackson shootout, the LA Police Department had foreknowledge of it. They were linked to the Squad 19 in Washington. But the point is, by allowing it to happen in the staged manner they did, they get all the laws of repression that follow. They kill a bunch of radicals besides, and they get their selected patsy. Well, it seems now that the evidence of the Ellsberg case was that they were bugging Daniel Ellsberg before the papers were printed. But they allowed them to be printed so they could have the long trial, hopefully get him in jail, and then they could say, we have this White House espionage group because secrets were being leaked. And then, under that guise, Mr. Hunt and Liddy move into the White House and get ready for the martial law plan, because on the guise that they have to protect from the leaks of the Pentagon Papers. So the news today said that their purpose was to collect and evaluate information about radicals and anti-war. This is in May 73. But in the fall of 71, Louis Tackwood said that the upper echelon operatives, under the guise of protecting inside the White House secrets like the Pentagon Papers, you see, they keep them from reaching the public. Now, in the White House, you had Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman, who were your links to your CIA and your FBI. Those were your chain of commands. It comes out in the newspaper article today. These articles are very important now. Haldeman was a direct link to the president who could go to Richard Helms for anything he wanted. You heard it on the news tonight. If it came from the president, they could even do robbery, anything the president wanted. It was all right. Haldeman was the link from the president to the CIA and Mr. Colson, all of them intelligence operatives, connecting to all intelligence operations in the country. And the White House phone that Howard Hunt had to Mr. Barker getting ready to hire provocateurs. Mr. Ehrlichman's desk was filled with information which, if national security was involved, didn't belong with him at all, except that he's part of the martial law plan. And he had the Ellsberg papers, he had FBI reports, he had information that J. Edgar Hoover had against John Mitchell and Richard Nixon. Ehrlichman is the link to Mr. Sullivan of the FBI, former FBI man. And Mardian, Robert Mardian, the Assistant Attorney General, and John Mitchell could go back and forth from the Justice Department every day to the White House to Mr. Ehrlichman. This is where your martial law plan came in. If they would win the election by any manner, it didn't matter, and they could repress any youth group movement people. They had their list and come down at the time of the martial law plan. Now, this group was an intelligence evaluation committee. This is in the newspaper today, that operated out of the Justice Department and the Internal Security Division. This is what I have been trying to say for years on political assassinations or group, that there's my research is a special group that works as a clandestine operation out of the Justice Department and the Internal Security. You see, I've tried to say this in my article, and I say it all the time, that the National Security Council was set up after World War II to keep the wealth, labor, minerals, energy of the world into the hands of just a few conglomerates, and that the National Security Council had the means, through the Central Intelligence Agency, to overthrow any country that they deemed it necessary for national security if they were going more to the left than the right. We overthrew these countries and put in military dictatorships. Now, the revelations about this secret intelligence unit said the bulk of the orders for this unit came from John Ehrlichman. That ties in with the Domestic Council and the Domestic Office of Management Budget. Last week on KLRB, we talked about writing to members of the Senate and don't have them approve of Roy Ash and Fred Malek as head of the Office of Management Budget. Well, Richard Nixon withdrew that opportunity this week and said, I'm going to veto your privilege. You can't investigate Roy Ash or his connections or what he's doing in the White House. Out of the hearings of Robert Odle, we learned that Fred Malek, who we spoke about last week in terms of graduate of West Point, a military man, was in charge of hiring over 500 White House aides before he went into the Office of Management Budget. So he's placed all of his own espionage operatives through the whole White House system. And there's still so much flushing out to do that it's really very complicated. But John Ehrlichman was in charge of the entire espionage operation. The man came from J. Walter Thompson Agency. He can go directly to Richard Helms, this is his power, and say, I want equipment disguises, I want aliases, I want passports. They got their money. The power that John Ehrlichman has is to go to the head of the intelligence agencies, and they provide them with anything they want. He also can keep FBI files and hidden tapes, anything on J. Edgar Hoover. He has control of two agencies, the FBI, working with Mr. Sullivan and Mardian, and he has control of the CIA. He can request anything he wants. He can go to the CIA and say, stop Patrick Gray from investigating the Watergate. They work together. They work very close. There was a friction there between J. Edgar Hoover and the CIA. I still believe that J. Edgar Hoover was murdered. I'd like to see his body exhumed. There was a power play between Mardian and Sullivan and J. Edgar Hoover and the White House, the National Security Council, and they wanted control of the FBI after it was built up by J. Edgar Hoover. And the control, again, was under the martial law people. Roy Ash, whose Lytton industry overthrew Greece, put in the great military junta, and the controls with Mr. Ehrlichman. Now, the Internal Security Division of the Justice Department, Robert Mardian's group, supplied for the committee to re-elect the president intelligence information on every group in the country. Donald Segretti said that there were operatives inside the George Wallace camp. I called the Wallace people, but again, he's encircled with all kinds of operatives that control him very tightly. When George Wallace was shot, the argument that there could be no conspiracy was that Arthur Bremer wouldn't know where he is at the shopping center, where he's speaking that day, or when Arthur Bremer was at the Waldorf Astoria and Hubert Humphrey had been there shortly, or when he was in Canada and Richard Nixon was there and he was in the crowd, they'd say, well, how do you know all these things? Well, when this large espionage squad has been working for years and they know every Republican and every Democrat, and the paper said today there's over 100 Watergates, 100 political offices where appointments come. You know, they don't land in small towns. They don't take a helicopter and say, I'm going out in Big Sur. They go to a big city like San Francisco where they get a lot of votes. So the big cities are all infiltrated. If there's 100 cities where candidates are going to land or be or stay, 100 places in the country where they're going to stay in that time period, the intelligence operation has them all covered. So that you no longer can say to me, well, nobody knew where George Wallace was going to be that day, because they have admitted that they have over 100 offices, and it may turn out to be more, but they know where every candidate was every day because they infiltrated the Republicans and the Democrats and the American Independent Party. This secret committee was supplied by the Justice Department on the anti-war groups, on the radicals, and McCord would visit every day the analysis and evaluation section of Internal Security Division. When he said that the other day in front of the committee, Senator Weicker just said, I haven't got any more to ask. He could not believe that a man working for a committee to re-elect the president had access to the Justice Department files every single day. This select group in the Justice Department was its own intelligence committee, used for political purposes, and it was answerable only to the White House. The paper will be filled with this all week. I think it's hard for people to grasp a lot of the meaning of this because it's coming in so heavy. So I thought I would go over it with you, because what they said again is it's a secret group working from the Justice Department. It's an intelligence committee for political uses, answerable only to the White House. And this is the Gestapo that Louis Tagwood talked about, that's linked to Evelyn Younger in California. This is the secret police force. This affects the LA Police Department, the prisons, the planned conspiracies, the killing of minorities, the imprisoning of innocent people, separating the prison radicals. It is an attack group. There's nothing preventive about this group. And please write letters as they say we were afraid of radicals, and keep reminding them they were an attack group against hippies and blacks and minorities. They were not protecting against demonstrations. They had demonstrators for hire. That was in the paper this week, demonstrations for hire. Now, this unit was set up by the Nixon administration and was run out of the White House. You see, by putting it in the White House, you couldn't say that the FBI was involved in political assassinations. You couldn't say that the CIA was involved. But the role that the Justice Department has is to burn the evidence of the conspiracies as it's picked up by the police departments at the local level. The role the intelligence agencies have are to produce the typewriters, the alias, the secret money washing, sending it back and forth, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, the disguises, the wigs, the techniques, the electronic equipment. They could produce it all. The Treasury Department, where G. Gordon Liddy was and Mr. Caulfield was there, has the money. The crisp $100 bills come out of the Treasury Department, and it goes right into the White House, because no one hardly was going to blame the president for anything. So the FBI looks clean, the CIA looks clean, and they all work together. The group was operated in the Justice Department by a Mr. Bernard Wells, a former FBI agent. Everywhere here, Alfred Baldwin, all of the men are, in quotes, former FBI agents. It reminds me of the Wackenhut Corporation, which is a private police force down in Florida that extends all over the country, and they're all ex-FBI agents. When they leave there, they seem to go, a good many of them, into a secret police force that had planned to overthrow the country if necessary, and still can do it. They're in tight control right now. Now, they went on to admit that this large secret police force includes the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Council, and various other police officials and units. Now, this is exactly what I tried to explain in The Realist, and it's 10 months later, and the framework of the espionage squads is coming out. It's an undercover activity with elaborate systems, including infiltration, double agents, and it's run by the FBI and the Internal Security Division. I'm going over this slowly this time. I usually talk fast, but this is what the Realist article is all about, that there is an espionage group that works inside the White House that separates itself from the Republican Party, that sabotages every Democrat that gets in the way, and that it has the cooperation of the White House, the FBI, the CIA, the Treasury Department, and the local police departments that are completely infiltrated. Now, the news this week is that there may be 25 or 100 Watergates. But the important thing to remember about the secret police unit that goes under the name of National Security, the important thing to know is that all the hiding of money, the secret names, the aliases, wouldn't really be necessary. This operation was done in a secret manner because there were going to be more than forging and robbing and wiretapping. It involves violence and murders, and people begin to become more investigative if a murder is committed. Not very much more investigative, but they tend to take a double look if a murder is committed. Nobody seemed to care about Martha Mitchell being assaulted, but the chain of command is broken, so it's hard to find these people. And now the news is showing you the way it breaks down. Robert Mardian from the Internal Security functioned there and used two methods. He had paid to order demonstrators, and then he had his wiretaps and his undercover